really am about serving this community, getting things done, and working with this council to make life better for the city of Seattle and for the residents of District 2.
Well, you are hearing from the newest Seattle City Council member, Mark Solomon, appointed to replace Tammy Morales after she stepped down from her position in District 2. What are his priorities? Why did the council choose him for this role? And what's on the docket for him and the rest of the council as the city takes on challenges ranging from new zoning regulations to Seattle's sanctuary city status? So much to cover, and thank you for taking the time to consider all this and more this week with us on Seattle News, Views, and Brews, your coffee break political podcast. I'm Brian Callanan. I'm a host on the Seattle channel. The views expressed here are mine, and I'm with my co-host once again, David Croman. David, I got to tell you, we are standing on the brink of one of the greatest horrors ever to face the greater Seattle area. A trace of snow expected over the weekend. I'm only half kidding on hyperbole there. I wanted your take on this. Why is snow such a feared natural phenomenon in the Pacific Northwest? What do you got?
Because it's a hilly place and because it quickly melts and then refreezes and melts and refreezes. And, it's tempting, I think, to blame people's, people in Seattle don't know how to drive, but if you go to Minnesota or these really cold places, it's flat and dry and they plow the roads. Around here, it's wet, icy snow, and we don't have the infrastructure to plow it. So it doesn't have anything to do with skill. This is a rant from me. It doesn't have anything to do with skill. It's the conditions. And in fact, some of the worst drivers I've seen have people who are overconfident driving down Seattle's hill because they're from, the Midwest or whatever.
I hear what you're saying. When you don't have the plows and you have all those hills, that's a pretty big 0 for 2 there. So I appreciate that. I rant in the same way because it does get a little crazy out here sometimes. Great to be with you once again, David. Thanks also to City Grind Espresso, the background noise sponsor for the audio podcast. John, cheers to you on the first floor of City Hall. Thanks always to my show patrons, Rachel, Jared, Landon. Thank you for coming in as patrons. If you're able to support the show at $5 a month, you will get access to Patrons First content. We'll answer your questions about local politics on the show, so please do support the program for at least $5 a month. Love to have you. Also, I should point out the show is on Patreon to make that happen. Seattle News, Views, and Brews. When you sign up, you'll get a very cool-looking sticker, too. What a deal. Big thanks to Converge Media as well. The video version of the podcast is on Converge Wednesday nights at 7. All right, let's get going. Time for Right Here, Right Now. Well, David, at long last, the City Council has appointed Mark Solomon to the role of council member to take the place of Tammy Morales, who stepped down with 3 years left on her term. And did I mention Tammy Morales? Well, your prophecy has come true, David, after putting Tanya Wu in the council position 8 seat last year, whom Tammy Morales defeated in the 2023 election. The council has appointed now Mark Solomon, who Tammy Morales defeated in 2019. Even after she is gone, the council majority making it very clear they were and are not fans of Tammy Morales. So Solomon, he's a crime prevention coordinator, works with the Seattle Police Department. This is a civilian job, helping make connections with the community. I wanted to get your take on Solomon, David, because it seems like he's talking all public safety all the time, but I know he's going to have some land use work to do as chair of that committee.
Yeah, I think he's in an interesting position. I mean, first and foremost, he's not running again, which puts him in an interesting position because that means he basically has 10 months. And so that really strips down what his ambitions should or could be for that job. And I think he understands that. He sort of acknowledged that he'd have to be kind of focused on a few priorities. And so, I think what stands out is he'll probably focus on, he mentioned Little Saigon a few times and kind of public safety issues there, and nothing super specific, but just sort of talking about that being a point of focus. Talked a bit about kind of late night lounges, which have been a bit of a hotspot for violence. And then he'll be the chair of the land use committee, and the roles of that are maybe not quite as big as they would have been otherwise because the comprehensive plan has its own committee now. But he did talk about permitting reform being a big focus of his. And, I think between those three things, suddenly it's budget come October and, that's that. So, I mean, with budget, he really probably more has like 8 or 9 months on the job to actually, fulfill any priorities he has. That's just not a lot of time to kind of get up to speed and do anything. But, if he focuses on 1 or 2 specific things, he might be able to accomplish something.
Yeah, I'm interested to see where that goes to, and the fact that he's not running for the permanent job certainly takes a lot of political pressure off what he's doing here. But I thought it was interesting when you wrote about this in the Times. You mentioned that Solomon joins a an inexperienced council with only Councilmember Dan Strauss having served more than one term. 7 out of 9 members have been on the council for less than 2 years. Talk to me about that. Where were you going with that? What impact is that going to have with so many council members that don't have that much experience, Solomon included in this group?
Yeah, I mean, I think the impact will lessen, will not be as noticeable actually this year. But I would say it was really noticeable last year when you have 6 new members,
Hmm.
led by somebody who had been only been on the council for 2 years.
Hmm.
You know, the pacing of legislation was not kind of what you would expect of a council that had been there a long time. I think those deadlines for when you need to kind of get your priorities and legislation moving through the system, I think are a lot earlier than some members might expect. Have they not gone through it before? And we saw that there was a lot of rushed activity in August and September to get some sort of big ticket items passed, where usually I think they would be passed earlier in the year than that, so they could start focusing on budget. And so I think that is kind of really where you see it come into play. Things like I would say the minimum wage revision that
Right.
Councilmember Hollingsworth proposed, that was a big thing to drop in August of
Hmm.
any year. And so to drop that and then basically walk it back a week later, that's not a mistake that a council person who's been there for a long time would probably make.
Hmm.
Even Council President Sarah Nelson's proposal around the drive forward, the minimum wage for delivery
Hmm.
drivers, that was a little bumbled and didn't quite build up the political support that one would need to get that across the finish line. So it's just things like that where legislation gets caught in the process. That said, it's a quick learning curve. I would
Yep.
expect that this year, they've been through it once. They know the rhythm of the timing. I would expect that this year, we won't see nearly the same effects of inexperience as we did maybe the first year.
Got it. And we're going to talk a little bit more
You know,
about
that
some. Oh, go ahead.
I was going to say that said, now we have Councilmember Mercedes Rink and Councilmember Solomon, and Councilmember Solomon will leave, and so that will be another person. Councilmember Nelson and Rink are up for re-election, so who knows what happens there. So, this sort of this inexperience, while maybe will lighten a little bit as the current members gain a little experience. There's going to still be new blood cycling into the council, so it's not going to go away totally.
It's an important point. Thank you for bringing that up. There's a lot ahead, and we are going to talk about some legislation that Council President Nelson has brought up very early in the year in just a little bit here. But I did want to move ahead and talk about the latest on the impact of a new president on the city of Seattle and the fight to sustain Seattle's so-called sanctuary city status, really front and center here. So the state legislature passed a law in 2019 to establish Washington as a sanctuary state. Doesn't have a good legal definition there, but as the AG has explained to local law enforcement, being undocumented in the United States is not a crime under local, state, or federal law. And David, I know we've touched on this issue before, but now we are starting to see arrests by federal ICE agents all around the country, including some in Washington state. We're talking about immigration and customs enforcement here. They've been increasing significantly. And I just wanted to ask you, how do you see this sanctuary law impacting the work that ICE agents are trying to do here in the state of Washington? Because it almost appears from your reporting in the Times with Nina Shapiro and David Gutman, it almost depends on where you live, if the local leaders in your community are Trump supporters or not. This is a little crazy right now.
Yeah, it is a little, and the tough thing, and this is a bit of a flashback to 2017, is that President Trump says a lot of things, and some of them sound pretty dramatic, and then it's always the question of how much and how far he will follow through on them. I think there have been some bumps in ICE activity, though. It looks more dramatic than that actually is out of context. If you go back to the Biden administration, there was several hundred
Hmm.
arrests happening by ICE a day, even
Yeah.
then.
300 plus.
Um,
Yeah. Hmm.
and so, I mean, I think for President Trump's sort of loftiest statements to come into play, he does not have the staff, the federal staff, to do that
Mm.
across the country, and so would really depend, I think, on local law enforcement being willing to help. That is not going to happen in Seattle, and under state law, it shouldn't happen across the state. That said, you can see some certain counties who are kind of, Benton County, for example, they're sort of eager to help the Trump administration carry this out. And so the question is, do they want to pick a fight with the state, pick a fight with a new governor and a new attorney
Mm,
general? I don't know. Maybe. Um, Certainly those two have a lot of other things on their plate that they need to be dealing with as well.
yeah.
So yeah, I guess at this point it's sort of a question of how far the counties in particular, who in kind of more rural parts of the state, are interested or willing to test the enforcement, the state enforcement, and probably most specifically AG Brown's office to see how far he'll go.
Right. And we're going to talk a little bit more about freezing federal grants in a little bit, some news early this week. But I did want to consider the kind of legal what's next when it comes to the sanctuary law, et cetera. Do you see this going to that point that it went to in 2017 when the Trump administration was trying to withhold money from Seattle because of its sanctuary status? The city filed a lawsuit, et cetera. Is that the path we're headed down here?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think, you mentioned the federal grants freeze.
Yeah.
Um, that has the potential to have a more kind of immediate impact. Their willingness to do that, despite the kind of dubious legal grounds, suggests that, because like you said, there was a lawsuit around this in
Hmm.
2017. The Seattle sued federal government for that's to pull funding due to its sanctuary status. A federal judge sided with Seattle, basically saying the federal government can't use that as a way to pull funding. There was
Hmm.
another grant. There was another court ruling though in 2019 that said the administration could basically put sanctuary status as a condition of grant funding.
Hmm.
Um, and so that kind of opens up the door a little bit, where maybe, funding that comes via the congressionally passed budget couldn't be touched, but grant funding could be at risk. And, for Seattle, I would say the significant chunks there are mostly kind of transit related,
Hmm.
projects, Rapid Ride, the erstwhile First Avenue streetcar that's
Yes.
never going to
Right.
happen. Those sorts of projects were going to get federal funding. Um, and so, the future of that sort of funding, I think, might be in a little doubt. I don't know how much of the kind of full array of federal funds, which probably in this year will be something like $150 million. It was
Hmm.
200 million last year, but a lot of that was kind of COVID related.
Hmm.
I don't know how much of that 150 million is legitimately at risk, and I don't know that we know that yet.
Okay, and we'll touch on this again when we talk about federal grants towards the end of the show, but we have to talk about what's happening up next year. A battle forming in Seattle over some old boundary lines that Council President Nelson would like to break down. We're talking about a plan to put housing in the SODO area and a battle between the labor unions here, really. We're going to break it down coming up on Now Hear This. Well, a committee meeting you might have missed snuck onto the Seattle City Council's docket this past Friday. The Governance, Accountability, and Economic Development Committee, led by Council President Nelson, listened to a presentation about possibly building workforce housing in the SODO area. So these are the old Chris Hansen properties. Remember this? When they were going to build an arena there, it brought out some old opponents, this new proposal did. Representatives of the dock workers say, hey, we made an agreement with the city back in 2023 to say putting housing in SODO is not a good idea. Then you've got others in the building trade who are saying providing affordable housing is the right call.
Just look at all the dock workers who had to take a day off work to stand up for our jobs and our industry. For all of you to renege on a deal to benefit one wealthy landowner and against the very namesake of the zoned area is quite frankly despicable.
Having housing down there, half of which would be affordable workforce housing that would be affordable for 75 years, is a huge win for the city of Seattle.
David, I thought this was an interesting story that kind of got buried in the weekend shuffle here, but does Council President Nelson have the support to make this work? Because we talk about experience on the council. Councilmember Strauss pointed out to Council President Nelson there were 5+ years of discussion leading up to this in 2023, this deal with the port when the city agreed to a plan for the future of these industrial lands. And it was decided at that point that putting in housing in this area was, to quote Councilmember Strauss, a poison pill, wasn't going to happen. You got Councilmember Kettle on the committee voicing some skepticism too. Where do you see this legislation going?
I genuinely don't know. It's interesting. You don't see Council President Nelson kind of out on her own like this all that often, but it felt that way. Um, Councilmember Strauss, in his own way, was sort of needling of the process. Councilmember Kettle said he opposed it going through that particular committee and not through the Land Use Committee,
Right.
um, which is the Governance and Accountability Committee.
Hmm.
Um, So it's interesting. I, I don't know. My sense is that she is kind of going a bit back to her stakeholders and probably her colleagues on the council and sort of trying to map a path forward on this because, like you said, I think its support on as it's currently written was a little tenuous. We certainly know where Councilmember Strauss lands
Hmm.
on it.
Yeah.
Um, to his point, at the same time, though, you can only own a legislative deal for so long.
Mm. Hmm.
You can't if you don't want something to happen, you got to write it into law. So, though sure, I mean it was a lot of work and energy and to get this agreement on industrial lands, new council members have since come in and old ones have left. And this is kind of the deal with legislating in City Hall is new priority shifts and things change.
Yeah. Tell that to the
So
dock workers. I
I think
mean, yeah.
there are limits, right? Right, and the dock workers will fight it, and it'll be a big legislative battle, and it might not go anywhere in the end. But just because there was a handshake deal a couple years ago doesn't mean that that's exists in perpetuity.
All right, that's fair. That's fair. I guess also I know there was some concern raised about the group that Council President Nelson brought forward to be a panel on this issue. It included some people from the construction unions, but it certainly didn't include anybody from the port. And I just wondered with that, is this going to be a situation where Port of Seattle and the City of Seattle, I mean, are those two governments going to go to battle here over this, or how do you see that part of it shaping out?
Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised. Yeah, like you said, I think probably the last fight over this, you probably would have to go back to the stadium fight
Hmm.
over kind of implications here. Um, I think probably the council would have to make some kind of offer to the port to, I think I don't remember the details, but I kind of think that's how the Lander Street overpass came
Hmm.
about. It was
Totally.
sort
Yep.
of
Hmm.
a larger kind of compromise, something like that where the city pitches in to improve mobility down there for freight. But as Council President Nelson said at the same time, there's a lot of need for workforce housing, and this is a plot where they can do it. It is interesting too, in addition to the port and the industrial kind of opposition to this, is just the larger question of why this is not part of the comprehensive plan, why this
Hmm.
is standing as separate. I don't know that I have actually a great answer to that, but it does sort of stand out that this is getting its own legislative process, even as the city has considered this sort of larger update to where housing should or shouldn't be built.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people in the audience, dock workers at least, saw that as, oh, you're just making the sweetheart deal for Chris Hansen who owns his property or whatever else. And there's some pushback, of course, on that. One last piece on this one, this idea that putting more homes, people in this area could improve public safety. I heard that from Council President Nelson a few times, and I wanted your take on that too. Putting more people in an area, does that improve the public safety? I guess you have more eyes on the streets, or whatever, but are you also putting more people potentially in harm's way when it comes to walking and biking and all the other things? I mean, SODO's got some issues. Does putting in more housing, et cetera, solve those issues, or does it make them worse?
Yeah, I don't know the answer to that exactly. You can look at I think crime stats in the pandemic do tell a story, which is when, and just sort of generally downtown, it's hard to argue that the lack of people in downtown did not contribute to certain rises in crime
Okay.
and general disorder. And so,
Okay.
yes, I think there's something to that. People talk about activating spaces, and
Hmm.
certainly building housing is one way to do that. This isn't actually, it's not a huge swath of land.
Hmm.
And sort of the way it's built and whether it encourages kind of foot traffic or anything like that. I don't know. There's of course also the question too about road safety. That
Hmm.
area is notoriously dangerous for people walking around. Um, so I think selling it as a purely as a means to improve public safety probably has its limits. But I also don't think it's worth dismissing entirely.
Yeah, part of the conversation for sure. All right, well, moving on, another meeting to keep an eye on this week with the Seattle City Council. The committee overseeing the comprehensive plan is meeting yet again, and a presentation that jumped out at me, David, was an assessment of the work the city of Seattle has done or not done when it comes to anti-displacement measures. So These are meant to keep people in their homes when development, gentrification is happening all around them. And the city, by its own admission, hasn't been doing that well on that score. The Equitable Development Initiative, EDI, as you've heard it called, well, the city put it into action in 2016, has distributed about $117 million to programs meant to help displacement. But it hasn't worked out well. The data is not complete. There's no centralized system to track it. Some of the groups working on housing projects don't even have the capacity to report out what they're doing. 60 groups were surveyed by an outside consultant, and only 3 responded back that they would actually finish their project by the end of last year. David, I know this has been broken for some time here. What are you seeing here? What do you see in this report? What's the issue going on here with EDI?
Yeah, I don't know. I'm still sort of digesting what that means. I mean, I think that this was part of the issue that Councilmember Rivera raised. What was it, a year ago,
Yep.
around the Equitable Development Initiative? Is this money getting out the door? Is it being spent well? Is it doing what it wants to do? There was a big pushback to that because over fears that it would slow the rollout of some of these projects.
Or kill them completely.
I think she kind of, right. She implied actually in the selection process for the new council member that, I think one of her questions was, how do you feel about accountability or something like that? Told me that this is something that she's going to continue to look at and continue to talk about. But I need to sort of digest what this means a little bit more.
Yeah, I hear what you're saying. It's one of these situations where I've covered these different programs for the city of Seattle, like the programs they have for utility help if people need help with their payment to utilities. And I was looking through this report. It's one of these situations where it almost feels like the homeless services situation to me, where you have all these different providers out there that are trying to help with anti-displacement, but it doesn't appear that they're all working together, and people don't even know that they exist in some cases who might be able to use that help. That I guess that's the accountability piece, or just I don't know, trying to bring this world of all these different helping organizations together. That seems like a huge challenge for the city, just in broad terms here.
For sure. And it's like you said, it's one that's sort of repeated over several issue areas, homelessness. You could probably say the same thing about kind of quote police alternatives. Feels like there's a lot of different organizations, both governmental and non-governmental, in the same space. Kind of difficult to figure out which one is doing what. And yeah, this is probably another one of them. I think clarity of government is something that Seattle could probably stand to focus on more.
Indeed it is. Indeed it is. Coming up, a pause on federal grants that has drawn attention from city and national leaders. How does that affect you? We're going to break it down on What's Next. Thank you for that, David. I did want to touch back on this issue about pausing federal grants. This news really heating up this week. The president is talking about this. I heard Councilmember Rink urging her colleagues to be ready for some challenges in this week's council meeting. Yet Senator Patty Murray saying this is an illegal overreach of presidential power. She said, quote, "We could see a screeching halt to resources for childcare, housing, police officers, opioid addiction treatment, rebuilding roads and bridges, and even disaster relief efforts. The American people did not vote for this kind of senseless chaos," end quote. A federal judge issued a temporary hold on this order as of Tuesday. But, David, we're talking about all sorts of things. Medical research at the University of Washington, programs for the city of Seattle. What do you make of this whole idea of pausing federal grants?
Yeah, it's chaotic. I think it's meant to be chaotic. It seems, like I said, the legal justification for it it's thin because this is congressionally approved funding. That is, in theory, how things are supposed to work, which is that Congress controls the purse strings. There was a follow-up memo saying, sort of walking back some of those initial sweeping pronouncements that they were all being paused. But I think what it does is just leave a lot of people really uncertain. And uncertainty in public policy is not particularly helpful when you're making day-to-day decisions. So again, like sort of like the sanctuary stuff, it's a little early to say exactly what it means in reality, but there is sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy, which is the pure chaos of it does sort of lead to more chaos, even
Mhm.
if there was not actually any specific policy impact just yet.
Right, right. And it just feels like another example of this kind of flood the zone technique from President Trump. Senator Murray was actually all set with a press conference on Tuesday where she was, or Monday, I should say, when she was talking about a resolution she has to condemn the J6 pardons from President Trump, but she really had to pivot to this. It's one of these situations where I feel exhausted, I think, with national news. And we're, what, maybe a week plus into the president's second term here?
Yeah, totally. I mean, and that is by design to an extent, not necessarily to exhaust people like you and me, but I think, this administration came in very well prepared to do all this, and I think there was a large contingent of people who have spent the last 4 years planning for these first few weeks, and so the plan was to flood the zone with pretty sweeping pronouncements and make it kind of difficult for any one organization or even judge to push back on it all. If these are your policy priorities, then you probably feel pretty good about how it's going. It certainly does create a bit of chaos and uncertainty, though.
David, I need to wrap up with you here. And I saw recently that you did a brief tour of the brief section of bike trail that the city of Seattle just opened on the waterfront. So this one section just opened between Yesler and Union. It's not all that far, but you checked it out recently. What's your review? What do we got out there?
It's really pretty. It's got some really cool art. I like the planting. It's a nice experience. I'm going to be a frequent user of it because it is right along my route. I've been waiting for a long time for this to open, actually. Um, I'm a little concerned that it's going to get clogged with pedestrians in the summertime.
Mm,
And there are a lot of opportunities for bikers and pedestrians to run into one another. So
mm.
I'm curious to see how that works. But it's a like I said, it in and of itself as an experience. It is an enjoyable one. It's a pretty thing. As a means from A to B, I think the jury is still out.
Okay. Is it a situation where pedestrians could potentially go to another trail or something like that? Or is this just the spot where bikes and pedestrians are going to have to coexist? What do you see there?
Well, it shouldn't be. I mean, this is a bike lane, and there's lots of space for people to walk on the sidewalk,
Hmm.
and there's a pretty good separation. But people are gonna want to explore the waterfront. Like I said, it's a nice path, so
Yeah,
maybe they and want to walk down it. There's also just a lot of spots along the bike trail where there's a crosswalk that crosses over the
I
bike
see.
trail, and
Okay,
so
okay.
I think there are just going to be a lot of chances for, and there are lights for bikers that and the pedestrians, and in theory that's supposed to regulate things, but I'm skeptical that someone who's like late for work is going to stop for the bike light when they don't see anybody there. And I don't know. I think there are opportunities for collisions,
Yeah.
but hopefully I'm wrong.
Yeah, I hope so too. It's just one of those situations where I've noticed it with a few different bike trails around the city and really in other places I've been too. It's some of them are very much designed for people getting to work, I guess, if you really want to use your bike as a work vehicle. And then some are really designed for leisure and having a good time. I think about going around at Alki Beach. I love doing that. And there's a separation there where you can go use a bike or walk. How do you find that magic trail that works for everybody? People who want to have that nice leisurely bike ride, and people who are actually trying to jam through and get through traffic and get to work.
Yeah, I don't know what the magic formula is. My favorite is I guess it's called the Elliott Bay Trail.
Mm,
It's the
yeah,
one that kind of goes from the waterfront past the sculpture park and then loops around and starts in a City of Seattle Park, and then turns into a Port of Seattle Park. And that one's perfect for me because it's separate. There's no cars. There's a big space for pedestrians. It makes it clear that this is for bikes, this is for pedestrians. You can get up pretty good speed, but also, there's enough space for people to pass. That is the kind of perfect bike lane for me. This one, I don't know how you would get around it just because it was always going to be in a heavily trafficked area.
yeah,
There's
it's
going to
going to
be a
be
lot of
crowded.
tourists down there.
Mhm.
I think they clearly designed it to keep speeds down. It's not super wide, and there's some curves, which I've seen some complaints about, but I also kind of understand it because you really can't have bikers ripping through there at 25 miles per hour because
Yep.
there's so many people. I guess they could have put it on the other side of the water or on the other side of the road, but I'm not sure that would have solved the problem either. So,
Yeah.
we'll see. It's not fully open. We'll give it some time once it fully does and see how it goes.
That sounds fair. This bike review brought to you by David Croman. Thank you very much, sir, once again for joining me. Thanks to everybody listening to Seattle News, Views, and Brews, where you can always find out what's brewing in local politics. Thanks also to patrons who support the show. Once again, if you're not a patron, get on it. Support the show for just $5 a month on Patreon. That would be greatly appreciated. You can hear us on Apple, Spotify, wherever you like to listen. Thanks also for watching on Converge Media. We'll see you next time. Seattle News, Views, and Brews is an independent production of Callanan Media Services. Copyright 2025.